Here we are back to genetics, genes and variation, as it relates to evolution. At this point, we have genetics joining evolutionary theory. You saw a little bit of that with the antigen-antibody reaction in the lab. What we were looking at there was proteins reacting with one another, but then scientists have taken it one step farther and they've looked at the genes. Changes in genes and chromosomes give us that variation. You have to look no further than your siblings, if you have siblings, or your parents' siblings, to see that all children receive their genes from the same parent in the same family, but they all look different. What else we already know is that a genotype is what we see in the genes. Genotype plus environment produces a phenotype. And remember that phenotype is all of the physical, physiological, behavioral, all the outward characteristics of an organism. So when we're talking about natural selection, very important to know, natural selection acts on phenotypes. Whatever physical outward characteristics make that organism suited or not suited to their environment will allow them to pass on copies of their genes or not to the next generation. So natural selection acts on phenotype. Got some other terms for you here. A population is a group of individuals of the same species. All of the possible genes in that population is called a gene pool. You've heard me say that before, the gene pool. And we talk about the different frequencies of alleles. When we did the peppered moth conflicting viewpoints worksheet, talked about the allele frequency. It's the number of times an allele occurs in a gene pool as compared to others. So the number of times. Here you see the gene pool for fur color in a population of mice. This is what you see here. So you have 48% of the gene pool, and these are based on genotypes. 48% are heterozygous black, 36% are homozygous brown, and 16% are homozygous black. Evolution is any change in the gene pool over time. So make sure you understand this. Natural selection operates on individuals, whether or not they survive and pass on their genes. Resulting changes in allele frequencies show up in populations. So populations evolve, not individuals. Here's the M word again, mutations. Mutations are changes in the DNA. They may or may not affect fitness. Remember, fitness is the suitability of an individual to its environment. We talked about before in first semester about mutations that are detrimental, that are cause a negative effect on an individual. They can lower fitness. And now we're starting to talk about mutations that can be beneficial. It's really important to make sure you understand, and we talked about this the other day with Lamarck, mutations have to occur in the germ line, so where gametes are being produced, in order for them to be passed on. So the only way they matter in evolution is if they're passed from generation to generation, which means the only mutations that are relevant when we talk about evolution are the mutations in the germ line, in the gametes. So mutations can cause variation. We talked about populations and gene pools, the shift in gene pools, variation. Genetic recombination in sexual reproduction is another one that we want to talk about. And this is actually duplicated from the last slide. So what I'm going to do here is write in the different ways that genetic recombination can happen. We've already talked about this in the mitosis-meiosis chapters. Crossing over, where those homologous chromosomes, the arms of the homologous chromosomes trade places. We have independent assortment. Remember, those homologous chromosomes can line up with maternal chromosome on the left and paternal chromosome on the right, or vice versa. It's completely random which parental chromosome is on which side. So there's independent assortment, and then just sexual reproduction at all. That we have genetic information coming from two individuals coming together and mixing and matching in different ways. All three of these can cause variation in offspring. Last one is something that we've talked about before, but we haven't given it this name. This is lateral gene transfer. This is when organisms pass genes from one individual to another that is not an offspring. So this can increase genetic variation. We talked about in bacteria a process called transformation, conjugation. Conjugation is when two bacterial cells get together and one bacterial cell transfers a plasmid to another bacterial cell through a little tube called a pilus, P-I-L-U-S. Bacterial conjugation is an example of lateral gene transfer. Lateral means across. Instead of up or down, lateral is across. Those of you who know football, a lateral pass is not forward. It's either parallel to the line of scrimmage or backwards. Single gene traits, just like they sound, trait controlled by only one gene. Cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, eye color more or less. There are 2 or 3 distinct phenotypes. And those are homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, heterozygous are the genotypes. Sometimes we can see just, brown eyes and blue eyes there. If you talk about blood type, you can have 2 or 3 distinct phenotypes. You can have 3, actually, or 4 different type of blood types if you have multiple alleles. But the most common form of the allele is dominant or recessive. It's not always what you think. Dominance doesn't necessarily mean most common. Got an example here. This is for a snail shell, a banding pattern on snail shells. With bands is actually recessive, but it's more common. Without bands is dominant. But we see that reversed. We've talked about in humans that if 6 fingers runs in a family, having an extra digit on the hand, that's transmitted in a dominant fashion from one generation to the next. But it's certainly not the most common phenotype in the human population. Polygenic traits we've talked about before, controlled by 2 or more genes. Each gene has 2 or more alleles, so a single polygenic trait, like height or skin color, has many possible genotypes and even more different phenotypes. So polygenic traits have more variety than single gene traits. Important to keep in mind. We see the characteristic bell curve with polygenic traits. Most of the population is here in the middle. I guess you'd call that the average, if I can keep the line in the middle. right there. And then you have people outside of the middle, the average, taller or shorter, depending on how you look at that.